This is Nellie Bly, a journalist from the 19th and 20th centuries who stood at the cradle of investigative journalism, reported on the Western Front of the First World War, was a co-inventor of the still-used standard steel oil drum, and wrote one of the most successful news reports in history when she went undercover in an insane asylum in the year 1887. During these 10 days, she endured and witnessed physical and emotional torture, and she wrote her findings in a book. This time in history, 10 Days in a Madhouse. Our story starts in 1887 with a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cochrane, who was 23 years old at the time. She was most famous under her pen name Nellie Bly, however. Born during the American Civil War in Pennsylvania, Nellie describes that she always had a knack for adventure and writing. Her dream, therefore, was to become a traveling reporter who wrote compelling stories from different places. At the time, as many professions, journalism was a male-dominated world with very little female contributions. At the age of 20, Bly read an opinion piece in the Pittsburgh Dispatch titled "What Girls Are Good For," which was very negative about the role of women in society. She decided to, anonymously, write a response under the guise of her pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. She sent her letter to the newspaper stating her critique. The editor-in-chief was so impressed by the letter he decided to post an ad in the newspaper calling for the Lonely Orphan Girl to make herself known. He invited her over and offered her a job with the newspaper. Her pseudonym, Nellie Bly, came from a similarly named song, which was popular at the time. At first, she wrote about the fate of the many laborers of the time. She wrote investigative pieces about factories, women's rights, and other topics. But under pressure from co-workers within the newspaper, she was forced to write about what her male counterparts considered to be female-friendly topics, such as home, lifestyle, and gardening. Unagreeing, the then only 21-year-old Bly decided to travel to Mexico to become a foreign correspondent. She spent 6 months traveling the country, reporting on the lives of average Mexican people, but also press freedom under the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz. Her critiques on press freedom eventually got her expelled from Mexico. Upon her forced return to the United States, the Pittsburgh Dispatch again made her cover topics that did not interest her, such as arts and theater. So she decided to leave the newspaper and move to New York City. When she ran out of funds after 4 months, she decided to take on an undercover assignment at Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper New York World, where her assignment was to investigate the reports of brutality and neglect taking place at Blackwell Island Women's Lunatic Asylum. In the end, she went undercover for 10 days, resulting in a long report which came out in the New York World newspaper, as well as book form. Her report is also the main source of this video. So let's dive into her experiences undercover in a madhouse for 10 days, starting with her admittance. As Bly met with the editor of Pulitzer's newspaper New York World, her assignment was fairly simple: infiltrate the insane asylum for women on Blackwell Island under the guise of having mental issues and report on the status of the facility. The newspaper would assure to get her out of the asylum after a couple of days again. A friendly doctor would get her the papers needed to be admitted to the mental hospital. Bly agreed, but under the condition she would fake the entire process, including finding a doctor that would diagnose her and admit her. This to protect the journalistic integrity and to report on the entire process of women ending up in these places in the first hand. She would uphold her act until admittance in Blackwell and act as she normally would again once she set foot on the island. This was to test whether people could actually voluntarily leave again. The institute was a place of help and care after all, not a prison people should be held at against their will. After some hesitation, the editor agreed, and so it's settled. Bly went off on her way home to practice her act of madness in front of a mirror. A little nervous on her own accounts, but oblivious to the horrors that lied in wait for her. She states that not knowing how or when she would get out of it, frightened her the most. She knocks on the door of a temporary home for working women. Because poverty was a major factor of being admitted to the insane asylum, she was sure to only carry $70 with her. As she looked for the matron of the home, she could only find the assistant, who informed her there was just one shared room left, which Bly took. She immediately started her act of a crazy, insane person. She murmured incoherent phrases and kept talking about her trunks that she supposedly lost. Her goal was to have the woman alert authorities, who would then have to take her in. She has supper with the other woman in the house, of which she describes the food as criminally horrendous, and continues her act of insanity. The other women immediately start getting dreary and scared. Little was known about mental issues back then, so some might have even still thought it was a contagious or something of the likes. Before bedtime, the other women in the house had distanced themselves from Bly, started teasing her, and some already voiced that the police had to be called to get her out. The woman who Bly was supposed to share a room with refused to sleep near her, and so Bly was almost already handed over to the authorities on the first night, until a Mrs. Kane stepped in. She protected Bly against the others and offered to share a room with her, staying awake all night to comfort Bly and help her. About this encounter, Bly wrote the following.
Only this one woman among the crowd, pretty and delicate Mrs. Kane, displayed true womanly feeling. She compelled the others to cease teasing me and took the bed of the woman who refused to sleep near me. She protested against the suggestions to leave me alone and to have me locked up for the night so that I could harm no one. How I longed to reassure her and whisper that I was not insane, and how I hoped that, if any poor girl should ever be so unfortunate as to be what I was pretending to be, she might meet with one who possessed the same spirit of human kindness possessed by Mrs. Ruth Kane.
After staying awake all night, even Mrs. Kane had to admit Bly suffered from some form of insanity, and so finally the police were called. The police escorted Bly out of the home and took her to police court for further processing. In the police court, Bly encountered a very kind judge who quickly grew very fond of Mrs. Bly as she reminded him of his own sister. The judge repeated numerously what a fine lady Bly seemed to be, and that she surely had to be drugged or otherwise poisoned to show these symptoms. He ordered for a doctor to examine her, who drew the same conclusion. Bly suffered from ingesting a nightshade called belladonna. She was taken to Bellevue Hospital for further examination. Reporters in the courthouse took note of what happened, this presumably drugged woman, and wrote short news articles about it in the papers. In Bellevue Hospital, Bly gets further examination from doctors and meets other women who were sent there from the same reason. One of the first encounters with other presumably insane women is with a young lady called Miss Neville. Miss Neville came across as sane as Bly herself, according to her own accounts. She explains how health had failed her from overwork, as she was working as a chambermaid. Her family, also out of work, without financial means, sent her to a sister's home, who then sent her to Bellevue because of mental issues. The accounts don't make it clear, but from her other tellings, she probably suffered from something we would nowadays call a burnout, as she had much anxiety and stress-like features. Bly encountered more such people who were in fact not psychiatrically ill, but also could not leave the insane asylum. Bly goes on to report on the second doctor's examination, and it is here that she first starts doubting the ability of the doctors involved. She recalls the examination as a conversation between her and the doctor, wherein the doctor asked questions about her personal life and starts assuming early on she is probably a prostitute or a girl of the town, as he calls it. He asks some other question about whether she sees faces on walls or hears voices before wrapping up the examination, diagnosing her positively demented. This is Bly's response in her reporting piece.
And so I passed my second medical expert. After this, I began to have a smaller regard for the ability of doctors than I ever had before, and a greater one for myself. I felt sure now that no doctor could tell whether people were insane or not, so long as the case was not violent.
Yet the examination was clear. Bly had to be put somewhere where others could take care of her, and so a steamboat brought her across the Hudson to Blackwell Island, to the Women's Lunatic Asylum. Nellie uses about 40 pages of her report to describe her stay at the insane asylum. As she enters, she is confronted with the harsh truth. All ladies are examined again with little care by a doctor who seems to be paying more attention to nurses than to the patients. All of them are again diagnosed with some form of insanity, even Miss Bly, who dropped her act of insanity as soon as she reaches the island. She goes on recalling her gruesome first experience on the island. Two aggressive nurses order her to undress in front of the other girls she came to the island with and bathe herself in cold, extremely dirty water in a tub. Nellie refuses to do so, to which the nurses threaten her to force her. When Nellie again declines, she finds herself being roughly and aggressively pushed down as her clothes are torn off her and she is roughly held in the bathtub. She is then dressed in dirty, torn old rags before being thrown in an ice-cold cell with barely any bed linen to be found. I have to stop for a second here to remind you that this was supposed to be a charitable place of healing. This was not some kind of prison for those who had actually done anything wrong to others. Before bedtime, in the ice-cold cell, she's visited by a nurse and a doctor who give her a drink. She inquires about what's in it, only getting a vague answer. After asking whether it is opium, a drug made from the same plant as, for example, heroin, she gets a positive answer. When she refuses to drink it, she was again told that they would force it on her by injecting it with a syringe instead of her drinking it. She came to the conclusion that if she drank it, she could still get it out of her body by puking. So she drank the medicine to the content of the doctor and nurse, and when they were at a safe distance, she put some fingers in her throat to get the drugs out of her again. That first night she got little sleep from the cold, her experiences, and the cries and screeches of the poor patients who suffered from mental illnesses. The following morning she is moved into a mess hall for breakfast. Her breakfast consists of stale bread, some sort of unknown porridge, and Bly describes the food during her stay as inedible. This is one of her complaints about the treatment of the women. They get very little poor quality food with little nutrition. The building itself was in a deplorable state, with broken windows everywhere. At this point, the building was about 40 years old with, as it seemed, very little maintenance. The cold seeped through every nook and cranny and, according to Bly, was part of the biggest torture in the asylum. The patients were given old, torn, dress-like gowns with nothing else, whilst inside of the building it felt like outside, where it was snowing and freezing. Women frequently fell ill, did not receive the needed care, and disappeared. In the accounts we read about a couple of disappearances of women who were treated badly, denied proper medical care, who were forced to take too much or wrong medicine, and did not return to their ward. It probably says enough that the island also had a crematorium which was burning frequently. Bly speaks to many different patients during her stay. Some are obviously mentally unwell and not easy to speak to, but a surprising amount of women seem very normal and definitely not in a state of complete insanity. Of those patients who actually do need mental care, little get more than the prescribed opiates, cold, and boredom. Instead of helping, the nurses make a sport of emotionally torturing some of the girls until their breaking point. An example of this is a patient by the name of Matilda. She had lost her mind over someone who had stolen her possessions, money, and estate from her. It is unclear who did it or how this happened. All day long she kept murmuring the question about who stole her money. At some point, one of the nurses, out of pure diversion and spite, started telling this patient she knew who had her money. The patient obviously became interested and begged for more information. The nurse then convinced the patient that another nurse who was present in the room stole the money from her and that she had to insult her. This eventually resulted in the nurse disciplining the patient physically and spitting in her hair. There are countless more accounts of the nurses emotionally torturing the girls. Also, other random black eyes and inexplicable physical marks can be retraced towards these nurses. Some of the doctors, in their turn, besides misdiagnosing and forcing all types of drugs on their patients, also took patients away to abuse the patients physically and sexually, according to Bly's accounts. Other patients told Bly how they ended up in the insane asylum. One lady, for example, caught her husband with the chambermaid. Before she could declare him for adultery with the police, he had declared her insane and sent her off to Blackwell. Other patients simply had difficulty in the language barrier. Near the end of the 19th century, many people immigrated, mostly from Europe, to New York. If money ran poor or things in the family went sour for some reason, these women often ended up via poorhouses in insane asylums. Oftentimes nothing was wrong with them, but they were simply, literally misunderstood. The biggest torture of all, according to Bly, was probably the boredom. Reading was forbidden in the asylum, as it was thought that reading was what made women act crazy. Other than that, no form of diversion, labor, or education was offered. This, in combination with the cold and copious amount of opium, would make anyone insane, she states. Here's her account.
People in the world can never imagine the length of days to those in asylums. They seem never-ending, and we welcome any event that might give us something to think about, as well as to talk of.
Another interesting facet Bly mentions is the stench of Blackwell, which, according to her, was caused partially by the kitchens and partially by the crematorium. During her stay, Bly talks to many of the doctors, claiming she wants to get out, but is denied an exit from the asylum. She also talks to doctors about the mistreatment, abuse, cold, clothes, and even about the fire safety of the institute, something which nearly gave her cover away, as the doctor soon started suspecting something behind all her questioning and observations. Also, the fact that she had visited other prisons, knowing how fire safety was conducted there, made the doctor suspicious about her behavior. After 10 days, a lawyer at the behest of New York World traveled to Blackwell's Island to get Nellie Bly out of the insane asylum, which he was able to do. After getting out of Blackwell, Nellie wrote a series of articles and a book about her experiences in the insane asylum. The story spread across not only New York or the US, but actually the entire globe. Her article became the most successful report Joseph Pulitzer has ever published, to which she became one of the most known journalists of her time. Her focus, however, was, according to her, not on her success, but on the patients left behind. The mayor and other council people launched investigations into Blackwell. When she was offered a large sum of money on her success, she only accepted base rate and donated the rest to an orphanage. In the end, she had to come in front of a grand jury who wanted to know about her experiences in Blackwell. She went back to the island with members of the grand jury. Nellie Bly asked for patients she knew to be brought in front of the jury to prove them they were in the institutions against their will and that they were not in fact mentally ill. She was able to free some of these women. In the end, it turned out that the staff consisted of convicted felons from a nearby penitentiary to save costs, explaining the gruesome and aggressive behaviors showed. The superintendent of the insane asylum spoke to Nellie Bly for her articles and her book, in which he claimed to try the best for the patients, but being severely underfunded for many years. The asylum was forced to make reforms, changing, albeit very slowly, the status of mental health patients and women around the world. The city of New York allocated an extra $1 million to Blackwell, which translates to about $33 million in today's economy. Bly went on to live an eventful life, covering World War I, becoming an industrial mogul, and traveling the world in 73 days, beating the Jules Verne book of 80 days around the world. She passed away at the age of 57 in a New York hospital of pneumonia. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time in history.